Welcome to the CHCH Newsmakers podcast. I'm Rick Zamperin. You've probably heard that Britain has a new prime minister. It's seventh in the last 10 years after Andy Burnham replaced Keir Starmer at 10 Downing Street. Who is Andy Burnham, and what, if anything, does he bring to the post that's been missing in Britain? Joining me today is Randall Hansen, a professor of political science at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. Professor Hansen, thanks for joining me today.
Good to be here. Thank you for having me.
We have to go back to the mid-1700s for the last time Great Britain had 7 PMs in a span of 10 years. Why so many in a short period of time?
Well, the short answer and accurate answer is that Brexit broke British politics, and you had a succession of prime ministers unable to cope with two related problems. First, getting out of the European Union, so getting a Brexit deal. That was May and Johnson. And then coping with the stagnation of the British economy, which resulted from this needless act of self-harm. And that was May and Starmer and Sunak to a degree, though it's slightly more complicated in that case. So Brexit is the short answer, what it's done to the country, what it's done to the party system.
As for Andy Burnham, who is he and what does he bring to 10 Downing Street?
So he is an old Labour man, worked with Gordon Brown in the Treasury, but more recently he's been mayor of Manchester. And he brings Labour hopes three things. Firstly, he's not Keir Starmer, point one. Point two, he is charismatic. And point three, he's a northerner, and this is very important, with a strong northern accent, who has a solid record of running Manchester quite well, which is enjoying growth above the rest of the UK and even London at times. So those are the three merits he has. He's facing many constraints.
Why is being a northerner important in this whole ordeal?
Well, it comes back to Brexit. You're going to hear that word a few times on the podcast. After the Brexit vote, it was decided because the North voted so heavily, the Labour heartlands, in favor of Brexit, which no one saw coming until it was too late, that the North had been neglected. Not wrong, it has been neglected, though it had nothing to do with the European Union. It was Margaret Thatcher. But in any event, since then, we've had discussions about leveling up, about more resources going to the North. And Burnham's great advantage is that he is from the North and can claim to represent the North in Westminster, whereas Starmer, though he had a working class background, was viewed very much as a metropolitan London, southeastern England candidate.
When it comes to the political climate in the United Kingdom at this point, how would you describe it?
Well, the country is wallowing in gloom. I was just in London for 2 months, and two things are happening. One, unlike the 1990s, which is sort of a golden age in recent British political history, the economy is completely stagnant. Again, Brexit. And secondly, the Reform Party is growing and growing in support, though they've actually plateaued and declined a little bit recently. So the other aspect of this that we haven't quite talked about is finding someone who could take on Nigel Farage. And the feeling was, not inaccurately, that Starmer simply could not do that. In the recent local council elections, the level of hatred expressed on the doorsteps for Starmer was simply immense and in some ways undeserved. But again, to take on Farage, he was viewed as completely not the right person. And that's why Burnham has become the white knight, the great savior.
There's been a lot of talk recently about social care reform in Britain, and I know that Burnham is going to speak to that on Wednesday. He's actually already said that the NHS is going to collapse without some kind of change. What do you envision he brings to the table?
Well, I mean, we shall see on the issue of social care and on the general issue of the state of the British economy and the amount of money there is for public services. Burnham is going to face precisely the same constraints that Starmer did. My sort of cocktail line when Starmer was elected is that he was going to have a 1997 majority, which is to say immense under Tony Blair, but a 1964 economy under Harold Wilson. And I think that turned out to be accurate. Uh, if the economy were growing at 3%, if there were all sorts of money to be spent, it would be easy for Burnham or Starmer. Now he's facing massive public debt, a stagnant economy, and the bond markets, which are watching his every move. So whatever he does on social care, and there the UK faces, as you say, an underfunded NHS, and like the rest of Europe, a rapidly aging population. Whatever he does is going to face those fiscal constraints.
Tackling the rising cost of living is another of his priorities. What pressure points is he looking at, and how does he deal with that?
Yeah, that I find particularly rich, because there's actually one way to deal with inflation, and that is to raise interest rates until there's no inflation. So he'll come up with a series of populist measures. The one on £2 bus fares will make a difference. But there's going to be relatively little that he can do other than keeping public spending down, because it's the job of the Bank of England. And again, I'm a one-note Johnny here, but inflation is something else that Brexit made worse, because cutting yourself off from your most important market resulted in imported inflation for the United Kingdom. So we will see what he can do there, but there's relatively little, again, other than restricting spending, which creates all sorts of other problems that he can do.
The first international leader to visit with Andy Burnham, the new Prime Minister of Britain, was Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine. Why was that an important meeting? Is there a message being sent by the Prime Minister of Great Britain?
Yeah, I mean, it was important in two ways. One thing that Starmer, I think, got absolutely right was very strong support for Ukraine. And after, or with the European Union, which, since the Americans pulled out, have been basically alone funding the Ukrainian war against Russia, Britain with the EU has played a very important role. So Burnham is signaling continuity there. Nothing is going to change. Otherwise, for any prime minister, when times are tough at home, foreign policy becomes much more appealing, because Britain can use its historical advantages, the fact that people like to come to London, how impressive Westminster is, to project themselves internationally in the hope of gaining public support domestically. So I don't want to be cynical. Both those things are going on, but the main point is continuity.
How do you envision Andy Burnham handling, if you can, U.S. President Donald Trump and the relationship that the United States and Britain have?
Well, as we know, as much more than anyone, he's a mercurial man, the president. So I expect he will continue Starmer's policy, which I found rather depressing and craven, frankly. I mean, there was no sadder moment than when Starmer was asked if a Commonwealth country that shares the same head of state as the United Kingdom, that is Canada, if Canada were attacked, if moves on its sovereignty were made, if Britain would do anything, and Starmer was completely silent. And that was frankly pathetic. Sadly, I don't think it's going to change, because without the support of the European Union, Britain is alone. Now, Burnham doesn't have the nice posh accent that Mandelson has, so that might go down less well with President Trump, but he'll keep trying the same policy, which is flattering the president, appealing to the special relationship, hoping to cut a deal which is slightly better for Britain than what the European Union gets. And Whether it succeeds or not will depend on, as ever, how Trump feels that morning.
Where do you see Britain's place in what Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney called the New World Order?
Well, Britain fundamentally diminished itself by leaving the European Union because all we talked about was economics. What we didn't talk about enough was the fact that the EU was a force multiplier for the United Kingdom because it was one of the big three with Germany and France in what is the largest market and the most powerful regulatory organization or regulatory superpower, if you will, in the world. So that was a terrible mistake. That said, remains a member of the Security Council, has the largest army with France in Europe. So it is quintessentially Carney's middle power. So I think it can play quite an important role. What I would say is that sources in London tell me that there was a great deal of enthusiasm for Prime Minister Carney's speech, but they fear there's not been a lot of follow-up. So if Prime Minister Carney wants to add substance to the call for middle powers to do something, I think that London is at the ready and obviously a very old and close partner of Canada.
Do you see Britain ever revitalizing the talks of rejoining the EU at some point? Maybe not within the next 5 or 10 years, but sometime down the line?
Jean Monnet, the founder of the European Union, or one of the founders with Robert Schuman and others, when the Treaty of Rome created the European Union in 1957, said to the British, and this might be apocryphal, but it doesn't matter. It speaks a fundamental truth. There's one thing the British cannot understand, and that's an idea, and therefore you will not join us. But there's one thing you cannot help but understand, you British, and that's a fact, and therefore you will eventually join. So yes, I think Britain will rejoin the European Union. I may see it within my lifetime. It won't be quick. It'll be a generation. But I think we'll see a gradual realignment, a joining of the single market, the customs union, hopefully in that order. And then eventually one will say to the British people, we're affected by all the rules. We're not having a say in them. Let's join. So I think the answer is yes. Eventually, Britain has no place outside the European Union, floating up in the northwest of the European continent.
One last question about new Prime Minister Andy Burnham. Do you see him lasting longer than 1 or 2 or 3 years?
He faces the same structural constraints that drove out the previous 6, again, except for Sunak to a certain degree. But yes, I think he'll survive to the next election because I think the Labour Party realizes it would be fundamentally absurd to change prime ministers yet again. And to say something more positive, I've been perhaps a little bit too critical. Burnham is bringing a great deal of optimism, positive vibes, a different style. He's very, very good with social media. And I think the goodwill, the fear of the disaster of yet another prime minister, and his positive energy, if you will, his charisma, that will buy him some time. And that, I think, will get him to the next election. Whether he succeeds or not is very hard to say. He's facing a very challenging environment. He's probably the least tested prime minister in post-war British history. And he loves to be loved by everyone. Boris Johnson had that fault as well. And if he's going to succeed in this job, he's going to have to learn to be hated. So we shall see. But, we all certainly wish him well.
Last one for you. You're in Germany at the moment. I'm sure you've heard from other world leaders, especially in Europe. How do the leaders on that continent feel about what is happening in Britain?
Well, the dominant view of Britain on the continent for quite a while was utter mystification with Britain leaving the European Union. That is over now. No one on the continent, none of the major leaders thinks about Brexit. It's much more a sort of British conversation. I think the view in Paris and in Berlin is that Burnham looks like a very reasonable partner that will continue those positive aspects that Starmer certainly did have. The greatest fear in all the capitals is of reform coming to power, but you have that fear within Europe. Berlin is worried about the national rally, and the Macronists in Paris are worried about the alternative for Germany. So I think the view of Burnham is quite positive, and there's a hope that he'll succeed domestically and internationally.
Well, all eyes are on Prime Minister Burnham, and we'll see how he does starting tomorrow with what is going to be a big speech on social care reform and many more priorities ahead. Professor Hansen, thank you so much for your time today.
My pleasure.
All right, and that is a wrap for the Newsmakers podcast. A big thanks to the all-star cast behind the scenes. If you like today's episode, click the thumbs up, hit subscribe. You can leave a comment as well. Catch the Newsmakers podcast on chch.com/podcasts and wherever you get your favorite podcasts.